I also give the subtitles. I also give scope for multiple subtitles of different languages. So I am also viewing, I am also reading that. So I think the notion of text and the notion of viewership or readership is drastically undergoing change, which as uh, teachers of English canonical literature, we don't know how to handle it. I think some of the work and the discussion that has happened today will push us in the direction.
Oh, absolutely. I think I couldn't agree. I completely agree with every single thing which you've said. The only thing which I'll sort of throw into the discussion, just to kind of supplement what you said, is that it's a kind of a dialectical relationship, right? This sort of the ability of, fan fiction, that kind of ways of totally like taking texts and making it your own. I mean, Star Trek is very famous for this, right? I mean, the Star Trek, franchise, was driven by fan fiction, where people rewrote entire characters, had like same-sex romances between like different characters on the Starship Enterprise to go where no one had gone before, and so that kind of stuff was very much going on. So that's one thing, but the other part of it is the economic desire to make profit. The policing of these texts comes from copyright, comes from the fact that a person, a set of people within a very commercial enterprise are interested in demarcating, the boundaries of the text in a particular way so that they can then monetize it and make profit off it. So I think it's this sort of dialectic, right? It's this dialectic between the two. On the one hand, because ideas of authorship and individual authorship and this way of monetizing, copyrighted cultural material is, as you point out, very modern. If you were a company, you didn't necessarily copyright your Ramayana version, that's not where you. There are other forms of patronage, being in the court and so on and so forth, are dependent on I don't want to celebrate that, there's a very feudal forms of patronage. But I think the way in which cultural material circulates now is very much linked to this capitalist way of making, money off cultural material. So some of the kind of desire to, and the reason why I think that kind of demarcation and specification of the text will never really go away, is because that's the primary way in which. So a filmmaker is interested in saying you cannot copy that, because I am the copyright for it, you cannot reproduce it, you cannot like use the image of Devanand or a scene from here and so without giving me some money, And so in that way, despite all the kind of transgressive ways in which the text might be messed with, there will always be the other force of saying you can't mess with this.
Should I ask one thing, that there are more readership, less readership, and more people watch movies than less number of people read the novels or the texts. So whenever a movie fails to represent the text, so say for example, you can take Unbearable Life of Sophie, and when someone is watching the movie, it is full of so much explicit sexual scenes, but the text is not about that. So it is giving a distorted version. So some people actually who are not going to read the text, or they don't belong to the discipline of literature or even cultural studies, they are watching the movie and they are getting the impression that, okay, is the novel about all this stuff that it is showing? So they make a distorted version of the original ideas. So who is to blame, or how the novel is going to be treated by those people? So they are not getting any interest to read it, or getting a different idea, distinct idea from what it represents. So what do you like to say?
I think, this again is something which I've written about very systematically, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to say this. I think as a translation studies scholar, one of the things that I'm really interested in doing is and this again goes back to public humanities, right? It's one of the ways in which I think I want to take my work, my more specialized work as a scholar out into the public, is that I think one of the things which we need to do is to really try and disseminate a fairly wide idea of what I call the culture of translation, right? By which I mean that we need to change the ways, and I see change even in India. In the United States, definitely change the ways, but even in India, because we have begun to, going back many decades now, think about translation in the way in which, because of copyright and things like that. the important thing here is to really understand that a translation is never in a relationship of one-to-one fidelity with the source text. And the way in which I like to illustrate this issue is by pointing out that when I write about Chinua Achebe's great novel Things Fall Apart as a critic, I'm offering an interpretation of the Things Fall Apart. But nobody who's reading my critical essay of that novel is going to think that I'm translating the novel. I might even summarize the text, I might summarize the story, I might make all kinds of claims about Okonkwo and like about Igbo culture, whatever. I might, say any number of things, but it is not, the relationship between my critical essay and Things Fall Apart is that of an interpretation. And I think it's important to recognize, now if I were to take Things Fall Apart and translate it into Tamil, which I would never do because it'd be awful, but let's pretend that I set out to do this, my Tamil version of Things Fall Apart is similarly an interpretation. And I think we need to acknowledge that fact head on, right? And we need to make as popular as possible that particular notion of translation, because the problem that you're defining is not the problem of the translation itself, it's the problem of the reception of the translation, right? So it's because people expect to find a kind of a faithful representation that, whereas what we need to do is to recognize that these are interpretations. Now this doesn't mean that we can't have arguments, right? So somebody reading my hypothetical Tamil translation of Things Fall Apart can say, well, this is an awful translation, not because Shankar doesn't get it right, or doesn't faithfully capture it, but because his translation makes claims about the original Things Fall Apart, which I don't think can be instantiated. You see, it's a different kind of an argument. It's the same way in which people say, well, I disagree with his critical essay on Things Fall Apart because he misses this, that, or the other. We're no longer judging translations or adaptations on the criterion of fidelity, right? Which I think is a complete illusion. I mean, I think it's totally not, which is why even the words that we use in many languages, like anuvad, in Hindi, simply means to speak after. It doesn't mean to say speak faithfully, right? So now, of course, these modern ideas of translation have entered even a word like anuvad, so that these expectations of fidelity are there. So that's what I would say.
If you look into the folk literature and the written and the adapted movie,
Can you say that again?
folk literature and it's oral literature and written literature and the adapted movie. There, in folk actually they don't have any authenticity. Actually, they follow means if I adapt some my folk story made a movie, I don't give a credit to any other person because of there is a folk story. How can you receive same kind of receive I also get with the folk literature. But the written literature comes with the authenticity because of I written this thing, I imagine this thing. So and it comes to the adaptation and other things, how they variate with these things because of if literature to the movie, what they take the concept of the movie in the story and the characters and the events. The remaining things they don't want because of they want made out of this literature to the movie. They don't follow any literature kind of inception in the movie. That is the basic form how they adapt into one literature to the world. And if it comes to the myth starts with telling a legend lore because of how the legend lore comes with the concept of I means centric. If I listen to the folk performance in Telangana, actually they have the transformations because of in literature and other things they don't have that kind of transformations. In folk have that kind of transformations because of the transformations comes according to the time period and the circumstances, their political changes in that period. Because of if I look in Telangana kind of folk or performance in the early period of the 20th century, they don't have any other kind of political interventions in that. Presently, if you look, the other kind of interventions comes in. So my point is actually if you're looking into the overall to the literature and to the adaptation, they take only the concept. The concept means the what is the concept in the literature, and that should be centric. Because of why centric? If telling a 10% story, who will interest in to listen the 10% story? They won't listen one person's kind. In movie literature too.
I think I think you're right, but I think there are film, and they tend to be the more experimental filmmakers, right? Not the sort of whether it's mainstream Indian film or mainstream Hollywood film, both of which I love in different ways, but they tend to be the least, experimental. They tend to take the least amount of risks with form, right? So you have to go to the more experimental filmmakers who, I'll go back to Semben because he's just fresh in my mind and I've been talking about him. And as I said, if you watch his film, starting with Borom Saret is a 30-minute film, short film, complete with voiceover. You have the voiceover of the cart driver throughout, right? And Semben himself has talked about how this was a carryover from his novel writing days. He hadn't yet figured out the ways in which to produce the interiority. So this is what the novel does, which I think is a little bit harder for the film. And again, I don't know if Karakesh will agree with me or not. But in the novel, I think is in a way, and as a novelist, I think I agree and would feel this is true, is that novel is a cultural medium par excellence. I can think of very few cultural media which are as powerful as a novel in its capacity to produce the interiority of a human being, right? The internal, mental, psychological, narrated. Poetry does it in different ways. Whereas film, because of the externality of the camera, which is always looking at the person, or is looking as if the person is looking, and then you can frame in different ways, and you can compose in different ways, you can edit in different ways, you can move your camera in different ways, yes. But the camera cannot actually be located inside the mind, So I think there are those kinds of issues. The point I'm trying to get at is that I got a little distracted. But one point I'm getting at is that Semben actually in some of his later films tries to bring folk modes of storytelling within film as well. He tries to, and you'd have to actually look at the films to see how he does it. So that in Borom Saret, he has that griot who enters the scene and performs it. But in other films, he tries to use special effects and various kinds of things which are only possible in cinema to actually give you a sense of folk storytelling. So I think that's what makes him such a great filmmaker, is that he's continually evolving and in dialogue with different forms of storytelling. So one other thing which I'll say, which you didn't quite bring up, but I'll take the opportunity to say this, is that out of all these different forms, the folk is very vulnerable in a particular way. Because if you think of it in copyright terms, whose copyright, as you said, there's no authenticity to folk storytelling. Who does it belong to, right? I tell the story, somebody else takes it up, tells the story, and nobody owns the story. This, I think, is fantastic, except when you think of it from the point of view of a capitalist economy where everything is getting monetized, right? If everything is getting monetized and the folk cannot be monetized, then in a way the folk becomes the most vulnerable of all cultural forms. Because, so there are any number of accounts of people who collect folk stories and make a lot of money off them, which the actual practitioners don't see a paisa of that money, right? So I think the folk is both an example of a certain kind of storytelling which is very sort of, utopian and promissory, but also very vulnerable for this reason, because it cannot be easily monetized, right? When it becomes monetized, when you have folk painters or folk, performers who then try to monetize, create, money out of there, so then they actually begin to look like the more conventional storytellers and the more conventional painters, right? It's one of the very difficult kind of issues that a modern capitalist economy puts in front of it. Any number of filmmakers, may have a folk performance in a film, but how many of them pay, make it possible? And even if they did pay them, then that itself is a transformation of the folk into something else. You see what I'm saying, the paradox of the situation there.
Nowadays, myths are rewritten, retold, and reinterpreted in many forms like novels, short stories, plays, etc. So, when a writer rewrites a myth, say he lends a voice to a particular marginalized character, like after Kurukshetra by Mahashweta Devi. So, my question is, as a novelist, as a writer, what do you think is the relevance of rewriting of myths? Like through the act of rewriting, are we trying to update myths to our present cultural ethos? What is your take on rewriting of myths?
I think the rewriting of myths is inevitable. I mean, I think it's inescapable, and it's what happens, and it's no point in saying it should happen or it should not happen. I mean, that's what societies do, right? I mean, Kambat's Ramayana is not Valmiki's Ramayana, right? I mean, Kumi as a character in Kambat's Ramayana is much more powerful than in the, so this rewriting has always happened, right? I mean, it's the way in which myths or epics, continue to stay relevant, right? I also don't think, I certainly don't want to make the claim that any particular, retelling, I think, myths can be retold in very powerful and to me, from my particular position, promising ways, and they can be done in other ways, in ways that I would want to contest and not accept. But here, I think, more interesting is maybe, and this kind of links up to some of the questions that we touched on very briefly, is what I think we should defend is the right of people to retell as they please, right? I think that we need to, like A.K. Ramanujan's essay, which was banned in JNU, I think, or, which is a great example of this. It's a great essay. It actually is an essay which celebrates the Ramayana, which is the irony of this whole, thing for me, is that it's actually by somebody who says, look how powerful this narrative is. It is true that he's saying there are many different versions of the Ramayana, and all of which, to my mind, signifies the power of the narrative. So I think we do need to, and I think I would feel called upon to defend the right of somebody to interpret and tell the story of the Ramayana in ways in which I might find very objectionable. I mean, that person has as much of the right to do it as I do. Right? But that right to retell is incontestable. And here also I'm going to be very old-fashioned, and I'm going to say that we need to make a distinction between discourse and physicality. Discursive forms of debate are not the same as physically attacking one another, right? So, for some of you may know about Perumal Murugan and the Tamil novelist and the sort of, the whole kind of crisis around the novel. I've read the novel in Tamil. I think it's a very extraordinarily beautiful novel. It does narrate sexual, a night of sexual passion during a religious festival in this temple town. I think it is actually an extraordinarily powerful novel which celebrates, or at least brings attention to, or honors the humanity. Let's not even say celebrate it. Honors the humanity of these people, right? But even if I disagree with Perumal Murugan, let's say even if I think Perumal Murugan has brought terrible shame to my community, the thing to do is to write back and challenge it, not engage in other kinds of activities. The reason for that is that a novel is not the same as other forms of violence. Right? And this distinction, I think, is really important for us to make and maintain, And so somebody can write and say all kinds of terrible things that I've written, and my objective then would not be to pick up the phone and call in and say, I'm going to cut off your hand, I'm going to attack you, I'm going to beat you up, you better not walk out on the street. Would be to write an essay and say, look, you're full of it and you're wrong, and this is the reason why you're wrong, and that's the way debate happens. And I think in that way, I think myths have always been retold, and often in folk forms, right? In folk forms there are stories which scholars have shown in which Sita is not at all happy to come back with Ram to Ayodhya, You know, there are all kinds of folk retellings which are very transgressive of the Ramayana's canonical form, and it's all fine. You know, it's all fine in the sense in which I may not agree with it and I might try to like challenge it, but storytelling is not the same as other forms of social engagement. And I really think we need to kind of insist on that, otherwise we close off that space. So that's what universities are. Universities are places where we engage in dialogue and debate, and we don't produce tanks and guns and weapons, but we produce discourse. And discourse is not the same as a gun or a weapon. It is an argument which people who disagree with us should challenge through argument.
Questions?
I think that was a sufficiently uplifting moment at which to end.
I think there's something to be said for this kind of a semi-structured but yet freewheeling kind of discussion that we have had. There are some things that we learn through a structured talk, a paper that someone comes here and presents to us. But there's also a great deal more that one gets when one is trying out ideas that are more in response to the questions and queries that are being formulated, half formulated. So I think in all this, what has emerged is that we're grappling with issues that are, in some ways in their formative stages. All of us, I think are very, at least those of us who've been here, I think, are interested in some of these very new challenges that we are facing, both in terms of the kind of materials that we are engaging with, the kinds of texts that we are engaging with, but also the larger context in which our engagement is happening. I'm so happy that this discussion could take place, and thank you for being so supportive and allowing yourself to be in some ways responded to immediately and so on. I also thank the two research scholars. Ankita, is from the Department of Translation Studies, but as soon as I asked her, she was ready. I'm so happy that we have such a wonderful set of research scholars who respond to our very short and demanding, requests and agree to be part of all these things that we organize. Gauri has just joined the department, and it's wonderful that she was confident enough to carry off this discussion today. I also thank the Department of Communication for providing the technical support for us, video recording the whole conversation so that it will be made available to us in video format, and thank the audience, colleagues from other departments who've been here, and students who've come and participated in all this. Thank you all very much.
Can I just say that I've spoken at DFW